The 7-year-old boy was dying in the arts supply closet. Caleb Mercer had maybe 5 minutes of breathable air left in his lungs. His asthma turned each breath into a desperate wheeze while smoke filled the hallways of Pine Ridge Elementary. Somewhere outside, beyond walls he could not see through and doors he could not reach, his mother screamed his name into a sky that had turned the color of rust. The wildfire crept closer. Flames chewed through dry timber on the ridge above town at 3,000 acres per hour, consuming everything in their path with the patience of something ancient and merciless. Heat shimmered through the windows of the school, warping the world outside into a vision that belonged more to nightmare than to Monday afternoon. And the only people who could reach him were three men everyone in town had feared just hours before. Men with leather vests, chrome motorcycles, and patches that read Hell's Angels. The one called Boone Crandall ran into the smoke without hesitation, following the sound of whimpering that most people would never hear over the roar of approaching hell. Sometimes heroes arrive wearing faces nobody expects. 36 hours earlier, Pine Ridge, California had been just another small town in the Sierra Nevada foothills. Population 3,847, drowning in August, heat and Sunday morning quiet. The rumble of Harley-Davidson engines shattered that quiet like thunder, splitting a cloudless sky. Elaine Whitfield stood behind the counter of her diner, her fingers tightening around the handle of the coffee pot as she watched through the plate glass window. 12 motorcycles rolled down Main Street in tight formation, their chrome catching the early sunlight, exhaust pipes growling with a sound that vibrated through the floorboards and into the soles of her shoes. Each bike carried a rider dressed in black leather, and the sight of them moving together down the center of town had a military precision that made Elaine's stomach tighten despite herself. "Lock the door," whispered Dottie Ashworth, her waitress of 15 years. Dottie's voice carried a tremor that Elaine had only heard once before during the earthquake of 2011, when the shelves had rattled and coffee mugs shattered on the floor. Elaine did not move. She had lived in Pine Ridge for 32 years. She had raised two daughters in the house on Birch Lane. She had buried her husband Frank in the cemetery on Oakwood Hill 7 years ago and stood at his grave every Sunday after church talking to him about the diner and the weather and the way their grandchildren were growing. She had survived the recession of 2008 when half the shops on Main Street boarded their windows and never reopened. She had weathered the drought years when the reservoir dropped to 30% capacity and the hills turned the color of old parchment. She was not going to let a motorcycle club intimidate her in her own establishment. The bikes pulled into the angled parking spaces directly in front of the diner. Through the window, Elaine counted the riders as they dismounted. 11 men and one woman, all wearing black leather vests adorned with patches she could not quite make out from this distance. The leader, a broad-shouldered man with a beard streaked silver at the jaw, removed his helmet and surveyed Main Street with the unhurried authority of someone long accustomed to being watched. He had the look of a man who had ridden through weather both literal and figurative, whose face had been shaped by wind and years and decisions that left marks no mirror could fully capture. "They're coming in," Dottie hissed. She had retreated 3 steps toward the kitchen, her back pressed against the swinging door, her face drained of color. The bell above the front door chimed. A small sound, cheerful and ordinary, entirely at odds with the tension that had seized the room like a fist. The leader stepped inside. He was perhaps 55, with skin weathered to leather by decades of open road and eyes that held both weariness and something else Elaine could not immediately name. Sadness, perhaps? Or the particular resignation of a man who had stopped expecting kindness from strangers a long time ago. The patches on his vest were clear now. Hell's Angels, California. Below that, a smaller patch that read President, and a name tag hand-stitched in red thread against black fabric that said Boone. "Morning," Boone said. His voice was surprisingly quiet for such a large man. It carried the rough texture of someone who had spent years breathing exhaust and highway dust, but the tone itself held no aggression. "Party of 12. That a problem?" Elaine met his gaze directly. She had spent 32 years reading people across this counter. Liars and lovers, drunks and dreamers, the grieving and the grateful. She had served coffee to every kind of human being the Sierra Nevada could produce, and she had learned that the truest measure of a person was not what they wore or what reputation preceded them through the door. It was how they treated the person holding the coffee pot. Behind Boone, the rest of the group filed in with a quiet discipline that surprised her. They moved without shoving or jostling. Several nodded polite greetings as they passed. One younger man held the door for an older rider who moved with the careful gait of someone nursing a back injury. The woman whose vest bore the name Sparrow beneath her chapter patch had a canvas bag slung over one shoulder, and from its open top, Elaine could see the spine of a thick textbook. "No problem at all," Elaine said. Her voice held steady, and she was proud of that. "Booths or tables?" Something moved across Boone Crandall's weathered face. A flicker of surprise or maybe relief. It passed so quickly that someone less observant might have missed it, but Elaine had been watching faces for 3 decades. That small reaction told her more about this man's life than any patch on his vest ever could. "Tables would be fine. Thank you, ma'am." They pushed 3 tables together in the center of the dining room, arranging chairs with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this in 100 diners across 100 towns. As they settled in, Elaine noticed the reactions of her other customers. Earl Pemberton, who had been coming in every Sunday morning for 26 years to read his newspaper and eat the same order of 2 eggs over easy with rye toast, clutched his paper tighter. His knuckles went white around the newsprint. The Braddocks, who had brought their grandchildren for pancakes, gathered their things and left so quickly they barely touched their food, dropping 2 20s on the table without waiting for change. Nora Strickland, Pine Ridge's newly elected mayor, sat frozen in her corner booth, her fork suspended halfway between her plate and her mouth, her political composure cracking at the edges. Dottie emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of water glasses. Her hands trembled as she set them down, the glasses chattering against each other with each careful placement. Elaine watched her for a moment, then took the order pad from her apron pocket and moved to the pushed-together tables herself. She worked her way around the group with professional efficiency, the same way she would take orders from any party of 12. Up close, details emerged that complicated the fearsome picture. The woman called Sparrow had red hair plastered back in a practical braid, and she had pulled out a medical textbook, Emergency Trauma Assessment 3rd edition, its spine cracked from use, its pages bristling with colored tabs. She studied between sips of water with the focused intensity of someone preparing for an exam, her finger tracing lines of text, her lips moving silently over terminology most people would never learn. One of the younger men, barely 25, had a sketch pad open beside his place setting and was drawing the view through the window with quick, confident pencil strokes. His vest read Canvas. When he sensed Elaine beside him, he looked up and his face held none of the hardness she expected. He had gentle eyes that belonged to someone who spent more time watching the world than fighting it. An older rider wore a medical alert bracelet on his left wrist. The woman with soft, kind eyes behind weathered features had a vest patch that read Dove, and she was showing photos on her phone to the man beside her, both of them smiling at images that looked like grandchildren blowing out birthday candles. A stocky man with enormous forearms and grease permanently embedded in the creases of his knuckles wore the name Torque on his vest. He ate his pancakes with precise mechanical movements, a man whose hands were trained to work on engines and did everything else with the same disciplined economy. Beside him, a compact, muscular rider called Diesel studied a road atlas with the same attention Sparrow gave her textbook tracing routes with a calloused finger. And the one called Flint, lean and sharp-featured, with the coiled energy of a greyhound at rest, wore a Sacramento Fire Department volunteer badge clipped to the inside of his vest, half hidden, as though he did not want to advertise it. Elaine cataloged these details with the same instinct she brought to everything in her diner. Not out of suspicion, but out of the habit of noticing that 32 years behind a counter had bred into her bones. She noticed because noticing was what she did. And what she noticed here did not match the story she had been told her entire life about people who wore these particular patches. They were polite. Every one of them said please and thank you. Nobody cursed, nobody raised a voice. They ordered eggs and pancakes and bacon and coffee, just ordinary people eating breakfast, except for the leather and the patches and the decades of reputation that preceded them through every door they entered. "We appreciate you serving us," Boone said quietly when Elaine brought his coffee. His thick fingers wrapped around the mug, and she noticed the scars on his knuckles, old and faded from a life lived with his hands. "Not everyone does." Elaine paused. She studied him for a moment longer than professional courtesy required, and he let her look without flinching. "Everyone's money spends the same in my place," she said, "and everyone deserves breakfast." She returned to the kitchen where Dottie was flipping pancakes with the nervous energy of someone defusing a bomb. Through the service window, Elaine watched the dynamics at the table. They talked quietly among themselves, showed each other pictures on their phones, laughed at private jokes with the easy familiarity of family. Sparrow had her medical textbook propped against the syrup bottle, highlighting passages with a yellow marker while eating scrambled eggs with her free hand. Canvas sketched steadily, and when he noticed Elaine watching, he held up the drawing. It was remarkably good. The Main Street view rendered in precise, delicate lines that captured the morning light on the storefronts. The bell chimed again. Sheriff Cade Holbrook entered the diner as he entered every room. Shoulders squared, hand resting on his belt, near his weapon, and his jaws set in an expression that said he viewed the world primarily through the lens of threat assessment. He had been sheriff for 8 years, a former Marine who had done 2 tours overseas before coming home to Pine Ridge and running for office on a platform of community safety and firm authority. He was not a cruel man, but he was a cautious one trained by experience to assume the worst and work backward toward trust. His eyes locked onto the Hells Angels table immediately. "Boone," he said, approaching. Not a greeting, just an acknowledgement, like naming a weather system moving toward your coast. "Sheriff," Boone set down his coffee with deliberate calm. "Just passing through having breakfast. No trouble." "See that it stays that way." Holbrook's voice carried through the silent diner. Every conversation had stopped. Every customer was watching. "Pine Ridge is a quiet town. We like it that way." "Understood." Boone's tone remained neutral, but Elaine noticed the tension in his shoulders the way the other club members had gone still. Not aggressive, but alert. Ready. The studied stillness of people who had been on the receiving end of this conversation many times before in many towns and had learned that the safest response was no response at all. Holbrook held the look for a long moment, then nodded curtly and moved to the counter. Elaine poured him coffee without being asked. She had been pouring Cade Holbrook's coffee for 8 years, and she knew his moods as well as she knew the weather patterns over the mountains. Today he was storm clouds and cold fronts, protective of his town and suspicious of anything that disrupted its rhythms. He was not wrong to be cautious. She understood that. A man who had spent his career protecting people developed instincts that did not switch off simply because the perceived threat ordered pancakes and said please. But caution and prejudice could wear identical faces, and sometimes it took a crisis to tell them apart. "They'll be gone by morning," Holbrook said, though she had not asked. "Camping up at Clear Lake tonight, Sacramento tomorrow." "They seem decent enough," Elaine offered carefully. Holbrook lifted his coffee, held it near his lips without drinking. "Decent's a word for people who haven't been tested yet," he said, "and I'd rather not find out what test looks like in my town." He drank his coffee, left his usual $2 on the counter, and walked out into the Sunday morning light. Elaine watched him go, then watched through the window as he stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, watching the bikers through the glass with a stillness that suggested a man adding new variables to a calculation that never stopped running. As the Hells Angels finished their meal and prepared to leave, Elaine noticed the tips. 30% on every check left in neat stacks beside the plates. The tables were cleaner than most customers left them. Napkins folded, chairs pushed in, small courtesies that cost nothing but revealed everything. Boone approached the counter where Holbrook sat, and the sheriff turned on his stool, his body language taut with the coiled tension of a predator, acknowledging the presence of another predator in its territory. "Just wanted you to know where we'll be," Boone said. "Clear Lake Campground, heading to Sacramento at first light. We're not looking for trouble, Sheriff. Just riding. That's all we're doing." "That's public land," Holbrook said after a pause. "You've got a right. Appreciate the understanding." There was something in the way Boone said it, something more than courtesy. Elaine heard gratitude genuine and worn thin from years of being necessary. A man who had to thank law enforcement for simply allowing him to exist in public spaces. The transaction complete, Boone nodded and turned toward the door. After the 12 motorcycles rumbled away down Main Street, their engines fading into the distance like departing thunder, the diner exhaled. Conversations resumed at double volume, as though the room itself needed to fill the space the bikers had vacated with familiar noise. Earl Pemberton smoothed his crumpled newspaper and declared to nobody in particular that it was a disgrace those people riding through a family town like they owned the road. Nora Strickland finally ate her cold eggs in small, distracted bites, her political mind clearly already calculating the public safety implications of motorcycle clubs passing through her jurisdiction. Dottie emerged from the kitchen with a look of pure relief, as though the building had been surrounded by wolves that had now moved on to hunt elsewhere. "I thought for sure there'd be trouble," she said, pressing a hand to her chest. You hear stories? Stories, Elaine repeated. She was wiping down the pushed-together tables, collecting plates and cups with the practiced efficiency of 3 decades. Stories are what people tell when they don't have facts. She cleaned the tables herself. She collected the generous tips, stacked the plates, wiped down the surfaces. And under Boone Crandall's coffee cup, she found a note written on a paper napkin in handwriting that was small and careful, the penmanship of someone who took more care with words than most people would expect. Thank you for your kindness. It is rarer than you would think. Elaine read it twice. Then she folded the napkin and slipped it into her apron pocket, where it sat against her hip for the rest of the afternoon like a small, warm weight she could not quite explain. That evening, as Elaine closed the diner and stepped into the parking lot, she saw the smoke for the first time. Just a thin column rising from the mountains to the northeast, 10 or 12 miles away, pale against the darkening sky. Lightning had struck the previous night during one of those dry storms that haunted the Sierra Nevada in late summer. No rain, just electricity crackling through air so parched it seemed to snap between your fingers. The National Weather Service had issued red flag warnings for 3 consecutive days. Extreme fire danger, humidity at 8%, winds gusting to 40 miles per hour. The conditions for catastrophe were assembled in waiting for a spark, and the spark had come in the form of a bolt from a cloudless sky striking a dead pine somewhere in the backcountry and igniting the accumulated fuel of 5 drought years in a single silent moment. Elaine watched the smoke column for a long time, standing beside her car, with her keys in her hand and the day's exhaustion settling into her bones. The column grew thicker as she watched, turning from white to gray to something darker and more ominous against the sunset. The wind shifted, and for a moment she caught the smell of it. Sharp and acrid, the scent of forest surrendering itself to flame. But Elaine was not thinking about fire. Not yet. Not primarily. She was thinking about the napkin in her pocket, about Boone's quiet thank you, about the way his face had shifted when she said everyone deserves breakfast. She was thinking about prejudice and assumptions, about how easily people judged based on leather and chrome and reputation rather than on words spoken and hands offered. And she was thinking about the sadness in that man's eyes, a depth of loss that seemed too heavy for its source to be merely the accumulated weight of being unwelcome in roadside diners. She drove home through the amber light of sunset, and as she pulled into her driveway on Birch Lane, she paused. Something about Boone Crandall tugged at her in a way she could not dismiss. The note, the sadness in his eyes, the way he carried himself like a man walking through a world that had already made up its mind about him. Inside her kitchen, Elaine poured a glass of wine and sat down at the table where she and Frank had eaten 10,000 meals together. She opened her laptop, a habit her daughters teased her about since she used only 2 fingers to type, and searched for Boone Crandall Hell's Angels. The results loaded slowly on her rural connection. News articles mostly, a few from years past. She scrolled through them, expecting the usual stories of bar fights and traffic violations, and the low-grade criminality that clung to outlaw motorcycle clubs like exhaust fumes. Instead, she found something else entirely. A Sacramento Bait article from 18 years ago. The headline hit her like a slap. The article described a house fire in Rancho Cordova, a single-story home on a residential street. The fire department report said the blaze started from faulty wiring in the attic and spread with terrifying speed through the old construction. A 9-year-old girl named Lillian Crandall was trapped in her bedroom. Her father, Boone Crandall, aged 37 at the time, was away riding with his clubs somewhere in Nevada. By the time he got the call and raced home, it was over. His daughter was gone. The marriage did not survive the grief. His wife filed for divorce within the year, and in the court documents that the paper referenced, she had written words that must have cut deeper than any knife. You chose the road over your family. Now your family is gone. Elaine closed the laptop. She sat in her kitchen with her wine untouched and her chest tight and her eyes stinging, and she thought about a man who had ridden into her diner that morning, carrying 18 years of that particular grief behind a wall of leather and patches and a reputation that kept the world at arm's length. She thought about the note in her apron pocket. Your kindness is rarer than you would think. Written by a father who had lost everything, who had rebuilt his life around engines and brothers and the open road, because those were things that could not burn down while you were away. She understood now the sadness in his eyes that she could not name. Through her kitchen window, the column of smoke to the northeast had grown thicker. It was no longer white. It had turned a deep bruised gray, and at its base, barely visible against the mountain ridge line, she could see the faintest orange glow. Somewhere in the Sierra Nevada, something was burning. In Pine Ridge population, 3,847 people locked their doors and talked about the motorcycle gang camping at Clear Lake. Nobody talked about the fire yet. Not that first evening. That would come tomorrow. Elaine woke at 4:30 Monday morning to the smell of smoke and the sound of her phone vibrating against the nightstand with the urgency of something that would not wait. The air in her bedroom was thick and hazy, a quality that had not been there when she went to sleep. When she pulled back the curtain, the sky beyond the mountains glowed a fierce, angry orange that bore no resemblance to sunrise. This was the color of destruction, vivid and absolute, as though someone had torn a hole in the horizon and hell itself was leaking through. Her phone displayed a reverse 911 alert. Wildfire advisory, Calera fire now 2,500 acres. Evacuation warning for Pine Ridge and surrounding areas. Monitor local news and be prepared to leave. She turned on the television in the living room. News helicopter footage showed the fire from above, and the scale of it stole the air from her lungs. It stretched across the mountain ridges like a living thing, an enormous breathing creature of flame and smoke that consumed everything in its path. Fire officials spoke in the grave, measured tones of people delivering terrible news in real time. They used words like fuel load and tinderbox, an unprecedented rate of spread. They said the drought had turned the entire Sierra Nevada into a bomb waiting for a match, and the match had arrived. Elaine dressed quickly, her hands steady despite the fear that coiled in her stomach. She called her daughter Lisa in Sacramento, assured her she was fine, promised to monitor the situation. Lisa begged her to leave now, not to wait for an official order. Mom, it is a building. You cannot replace yourself. But it was not just a building. Elaine's diner was 32 years of her life. It was the counter where Frank had proposed the booth, where both daughters had done their homework after school, the kitchen where she had cooked through grief and recession and drought, because the town needed somewhere to gather and she needed a reason to get out of bed. Every scratch on every surface held a memory. Abandoning it felt like leaving a piece of her own body behind. She promised Lisa she would be careful and drove to the diner through air that smelled like the inside of a wood stove. By the time she opened at 6 Main Street was already alive with anxious activity. People clustered on sidewalks pointing northeast at the wall of smoke that now obscured half the sky, turning the August morning into a false twilight. Sheriff Holbrook's patrol car crept down the street, his loudspeaker crackling with information and instructions. Evacuation warning in effect. Prepare to leave if ordered. Important documents, full gas tanks, emergency supplies. Be ready. The diner filled immediately. Not with people wanting breakfast, but with people wanting community, the comfort of familiar faces when the world outside was burning. Elaine kept the coffee brewing and the television on the news channel, playing its footage on a loop while anchors repeated the same terrible numbers. 2,500 acres. 0% contained. Winds gusting to 45 miles per hour and shifting unpredictably. It is moving at 3,000 acres per hour, Earl Pemberton said from his usual booth. His weathered face had gone pale beneath its permanent tan. He had lived through the fire of 1987, the one that had taken 12 homes on the eastern edge of town, and the memory of that smaller catastrophe was written across his features, now magnified by the scale of what was approaching. Winds are pushing it right at us. Same thing happened in 87, but this one is 10 times the size. Beside him there, Harlan Griggs from the hardware store nodded slowly. Harlan was 71 and had fought fires as a young man with the Forest Service before his knees gave out. He knew what fire could do, and the knowledge sat behind his eyes like a shadow. Ground moisture is at 5%, Harlan said quietly. Everything out there is dead fuel. Trees brush grass, all of it ready to burn. Once this thing gets a run going with this wind, nothing stops it short of a river or a highway. And I am not sure either one will do it today. Mayor Nora Strickland arrived at 7:30. Her usual composure frayed at the edges. She stood at the front of the diner and raised her voice to address the assembled residents, many of whom had come specifically because they knew this was where information would flow. CAL FIRE has crews working containment lines, she said, her voice controlled but tight. But the conditions are extreme. We are officially at an evacuation warning, which could become an evacuation order at any time. The community center is being set up as a staging area for those who need assistance evacuating. She paused, and Elaine saw her swallow hard before continuing. Highway 49 North is our primary evacuation route. Highway 88 East is still clear. But if the fire continues at its current rate of spread, she did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Every person in that diner understood the geography of their peril. Pine Ridge sat in a valley with limited access. The mountains cupped the town on three sides like a palm holding water. The fire was approaching from the northeast, and if it spread far enough, it would cut off every route except Highway 49 South. And if it jumped the river, which fires of this intensity regularly did, even that last route would be threatened. They were sitting in a natural trap. By 9 o'clock, the first evacuees from smaller communities northeast of Pine Ridge began arriving. Families from Crystal Creek, couples from Timber Falls, dozens of vehicles packed with whatever people could grab in the minutes between receiving an evacuation order and fleeing their homes. Pets in crates, children with wide eyes, elderly passengers who looked dazed and disoriented, plucked from their routines and deposited into chaos. Their faces told the story, homes left behind, futures uncertain. The particular expression of people who have just learned how quickly everything solid can become smoke. Elaine and Dottie worked without stopping, handing out free coffee and sandwiches to anyone who needed them. She did not think about cost or inventory. She thought about hands that needed holding and stomachs that needed filling, and the fundamental truth that feeding people was what she had been put on this earth to do. Other businesses followed her lead. The hardware store opened early, distributing respirator masks and flashlights. The gas station held its prices steady despite the desperate demand, a decision that would cost the owner thousands and earn him something no amount of money could purchase. At 11:15, Sheriff Kate Holbrook returned. He stood in the doorway of Elaine's diner, and something about how he filled that doorway, his hand hanging at his side, his shoulders carrying a weight that had not been there 2 hours earlier, silenced every conversation in the room before he spoke a single word. "Fire is at 4,000 acres and 0% contained," he said. His voice carried the flat authority of a man delivering facts he wished were fiction. Wind shifted again. It is moving faster than anyone predicted. The evacuation warning is now an evacuation order. He paused, and in that pause, Elaine heard the collective intake of breath from 37 people. The sound of an entire room understanding simultaneously that the danger they had been discussing in abstract terms had become immediate and real, and bearing down on them with the speed of wind-driven flame. "You have 2 hours to leave Pine Ridge, everyone. No exceptions." He held up his hand against the eruption of questions. Highway 49 South is the primary route. Highway 88 East is still open, but that could change. Take only what you need. Help your neighbors. If you know of anyone who cannot evacuate independently, report to the community center. We will get everyone out. His eyes swept the room, and Elaine saw something in them she had never seen in 8 years of pouring this man's coffee. Fear, not panic. Kate Holbrook was not built for panic, but the deep, controlled fear of a man who understood that the margin between success and catastrophe was measured in minutes, and the minutes were running out. The diner erupted. People surged toward the door, pulling phones from pockets, calling family members, grabbing car keys. The controlled anxiety of the morning shattered into something rawer, more primal. The sound of fear had a particular quality when it moved through a crowd, and Elaine heard it now. Chairs scraping, voices overlapping, a child crying somewhere near the kitchen. Dottie gripped her arm. "Elaine, we have to go, now." But Elaine was looking at the television. The news helicopter had shifted its angle, and through the smoke and flame she could see something that froze her in place. The road to Clear Lake. It ran northeast from town, climbing through forested hills before reaching the lake and its campgrounds. Even on screen, even through layers of smoke, she could see the fire had overrun that road. Flames climbed through the timber on both sides, creating a corridor of destruction that nothing could pass through. "The fires have cut off the northern routes," the news reporter was saying, his voice strained with the effort of remaining professional while standing in front of the apocalypse. "Several camping areas are now inaccessible. Search and rescue teams are attempting to reach." Elaine grabbed her phone and called the sheriff's office. The dispatcher answered on the fifth ring, her voice thin and stretched with the weight of coordinating a disaster that was growing faster than anyone's capacity to manage it. "Those bikers," Elaine said urgently. "The hellsangels. They were camping at Clear Lake last night. That is right in the fire's path. Have they been notified?" Silence on the line. A long beat that said more than words. Then in a voice that held resignation like a stone holds cold. "Ma'am, we are coordinating the evacuation of 3,000 people. We don't have resources to send anyone to Clear Lake right now. They are human beings. They need to be warned." "Ma'am, I will add it to the list. but we have confirmed residents who need transport assistance, elderly disabled families with young children. Our resources go to them first. And what about the bikers? Another pause. Longer this time. Ma'am, I understand your concern, but I have to prioritize the people we know are in immediate danger. Clear Lake may still be accessible from the north side. They may have already left. And if they have not, the dispatcher's silence was its own answer. Elaine hung up. She understood triage. She understood that a dispatcher managing the evacuation of an entire town could not prioritize 12 strangers camping on public land when there were nursing home residents who needed ambulances and children who needed car seats and elderly couples who could not drive themselves to safety. She understood the math, and the math was brutal and correct. But the resignation in that voice told her everything she needed to know. Nobody was going to warn the bikers at Clear Lake. They were outsiders, unwelcome, feared. In the chaos of evacuation, they had been forgotten. Or perhaps not forgotten. Perhaps something worse than forgotten. Deprioritized. Placed at the bottom of a list that would never be completed because the fire would arrive before anyone worked their way down to the names that did not belong to this town. She thought of Boone's quiet thank you, of Sparrow studying her trauma textbook between bites of scrambled eggs, of Canvas drawing Main Street with the gentle precision of a man who saw beauty everywhere he looked. She thought of the napkin in her apron pocket, hanging now on a hook in the kitchen. Your kindness is rarer than you would think. She thought of a 9-year-old girl named Lillian who had died in a fire 18 years ago while her father was somewhere on the road, unable to reach her in time. She thought of what it would mean if Boone Crandall survived losing his daughter to fire, only to die in one himself in a place where nobody came to warn him because nobody believed he was worth saving. Dottie was pulling at her arm, begging her to leave. The diner was nearly empty now, the last customers rushing to their cars. Outside, the stream of vehicles heading south on Highway 49 had become a river. The sky had darkened further, the smoke transforming midday into a bruised and ominous twilight. Elaine pulled free of Dottie's grasp. Go, she said. Take your car and head south. I will catch up. Where are you going? To Clear Lake. Dottie's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Elaine, the road is on fire. You cannot. I have to try. You will die trying. Maybe, but they will definitely die if nobody tries at all. She did not wait for an argument. She was already moving through the kitchen, grabbing her keys from the hook, pushing through the back door into the parking lot. The heat hit her like opening an oven. The temperature had risen 15 degrees in the last hour, and the air tasted of char and pine resin and something chemical and sharp that burned the back of her throat. Ash drifted through the air like gray snow settling on the hoods of parked cars and the leaves of the maple trees that lined Main Street, coating the world in a fine powder that turned everything the same dead color. Elaine climbed into her sedan and pulled onto Main Street, turning north while everyone else drove south. She passed Sheriff Holbrook's patrol car at the main intersection, and he turned to stare at her with an expression of pure disbelief. She saw his mouth form a word, maybe her name, maybe a curse, but she did not stop to find out. She did not have time, and she was not sure she could articulate what was driving her anyway. It was something beyond logic, beyond the careful risk assessment that had kept her alive and solvent for 60 years. It was the certainty that you did not leave people to die simply because their leather vests frightened you. It was a napkin in an apron pocket and a 9-year-old girl named Lillian who had already died once in a fire that nobody could prevent. Elaine could not go back 18 years and save Boone Crandall's daughter, but she could drive north and try to save the man himself. She drove north on County Road 14, the route to Clear Lake. For the first 2 miles, the road was clear. Smoky visibility down to 100 yards, but passable. Then the smoke thickened. At 3 miles, she could barely see the road ahead. At 4 miles, she had to slow to a crawl, navigating by the feel of the tires on asphalt, the world reduced to a gray and orange haze that pressed against the windows like something alive and hungry. At mile 5, she saw the glow through the smoke to her right. Close. Too close. The fire had moved faster than anyone predicted, and the trees lining the road were not just smoking. They were burning. She could see flames climbing the trunks, could hear the sound of them above her engine. A sound like a freight train mixed with a furnace, the collective voice of 1,000 trees surrendering their existence to heat. A burning branch fell across the road 50 yards ahead, then another. Elaine braked hard, her tires sliding on the ash-covered asphalt. Through the windshield, she could see it clearly now. The road ahead was impassable. Not merely dangerous or risky, but genuinely physically impassable. Flames crossed the road in a continuous sheet, and the heat radiating through her closed windows was intense enough to make her skin prickle with warning. She sat in her car at the edge of the inferno, gripping the steering wheel with both hands, and felt something crack inside her chest. She had come to save them, and she could not reach them. The road was gone. The fire had swallowed it whole, and there was nothing a 60-year-old woman in a sedan could do against that kind of destruction. She turned the car around. The three-point turn on the narrow road was the hardest thing she had done in years, not because of the mechanics, but because each degree of rotation felt like a betrayal. She was leaving them. 12 people who had sat in her diner yesterday morning and said please and thank you, who had tipped 30% and left a note she would carry until the day they buried her beside Frank on Oakwood Hill, and she was leaving them to burn because the fire was bigger than her courage and the road was gone. The drive back to Pine Ridge took 20 minutes through smoke so thick she navigated by memory and prayer. Twice she had to stop and wait for visibility, her headlights reflecting off the particulate wall around her, creating a cocoon of gray that felt like being buried alive. She gripped the steering wheel and talked to Frank, as she always did when things got bad. "I tried," she said to the empty passenger seat. "I tried, and it was not enough." When she reached Main Street, the town was nearly empty. The last vehicles were loading up the final holdouts, persuaded by the fire's visible approach on the ridge above town. Ash fell steadily, coating everything in a funeral gray, and the roar of the fire had become a constant presence, a sound that filled every silence and underlined every word. Elaine could feel it through the soles of her shoes, a vibration in the earth itself, as though the ground was trembling before what was coming. Elaine pulled to a stop near the main intersection, her hands shaking, her throat raw from smoke, her heart broken by failure. She had tried, and it had not been enough. The bikers at Clear Lake were beyond her reach, beyond anyone's reach, and the only thing left to do was join the evacuation and carry the weight of that knowledge for the rest of her days. She sat in her car and pressed her forehead against the steering wheel and closed her eyes, and for a moment the world was nothing but smoke and grief and the roar of something hungry approaching from every direction. Then she heard it, a sound that cut through the roar of the fire, through the wail of distant sirens, through the mechanical rumble of evacuating vehicles. A sound she had heard just yesterday morning when it had made her grip tighten on a coffee pot and her waitress begged to lock the door. Motorcycle engines, multiple bikes, coming from the north, coming from the direction of the fire. Elaine got out of her car and stood in the middle of Main Street, staring north into the wall of smoke, her pulse hammering in her temples. Her breath caught somewhere between her lungs and her lips. They emerged like apparitions from the gray. One headlight pierced the murk, then two, then six, then all 12 materializing out of the smoke and ash like ghosts riding out of hell itself. The motorcycles were coated in soot, their chrome buried beneath layers of gray and black. The riders' faces were streaked with sweat and grime, their leather vests dusted the color of storm clouds. But they were alive. All 12 of them riding in formation, their engines growling with defiance against the disaster that had tried to swallow them whole. Boone Crandall rode at the front, his gray-streaked beard visible even through the haze. Behind him, Sparrow and Flint flanked the formation. Canvas and Dove rode side by side. Torque and Diesel brought up the rear with the steady discipline of a rear guard protecting a convoy. And they were not alone. Behind the motorcycles, following close, came 3 civilian vehicles. A pickup truck with 2 adults and 4 children crammed into the cab and bed, the children's faces pressed against the rear window, tear-streaked and wide-eyed. Watching the smoke behind them, the way children watch the dark, certain that something is coming. A station wagon driven by an elderly woman gripping the wheel with both hands, her knuckles white, her face set in the grim determination of someone who had survived enough years to know that panic was a luxury she could not afford. A minivan packed beyond capacity with belongings and people and pets, and the desperate geometry of evacuation, a family's entire life reduced to what could fit between the seats and the ceiling. Families from Crystal Creek, the small community northeast of Clear Lake. People who had been cut off by the fire's advance, stranded on a back road, with flames closing in from 3 directions and no clear path to safety. They had been given up for lost by the overwhelmed emergency services that could not reach them. The bikers had found them. On their way out of Clear Lake, riding through smoke and flame to escape their own camp, navigating by instinct and the intimate knowledge of back roads that a lifetime of riding had burned into their collective memory, They had come upon three vehicles stopped in the road, engines running, families inside paralyzed by the fire surrounding them. And they had not ridden past. They had stopped. They had formed an escort. They had led these strangers through gaps in the fire line that only someone willing to ride ahead into smoke could have found. 12 people who owed this town nothing, who had been feared and dismissed and forgotten in the emergency's triage, who had saved themselves and then instead of racing south to safety, had stopped to save others. Boone Crandall dismounted in front of Sheriff Holbrook, who had been coordinating the final evacuation at the intersection. Boone pulled off his bandana to reveal a face blackened with smoke, his gray-streaked beard singed at the edges, his eyes bloodshot, but absolutely unmistakably clear. "Sheriff," he said. His voice was rough with smoke, but the words came steady and sure. "What can we do to help?" The question hung in the air between them, simple and enormous. Cade Holbrook stared at Boone Crandall for a long moment. Behind them, the fire announced its arrival at the northern edge of Pine Ridge, with a sound like the world itself was tearing. Structures on the outskirts had begun to catch, and the smoke carried with it the particular smell of houses burning insulation and paint, and the accumulated decades of human habitation returning to the atmosphere in one terrible exhalation. Elaine stood beside her car, smoke burning her eyes, ash settling on her shoulders like gray snow, and watched two men weigh each other across a distance, measured not in feet, but in decades of assumption and mistrust. Holbrook looked at the three families the bikers had rescued. He looked at the children climbing out of the pickup truck, coughing and crying and alive. He watched one of the bikers, Dove, helping the elderly woman from the station wagon with both hands guiding her steps, with a tenderness that seemed impossible to reconcile with the patches on her vest. He watched Flint checking the children for smoke inhalation, his volunteer firefighter training emerging naturally, the badge inside his vest no longer hidden, but displayed by the simple act of doing what he had been trained to do. The sheriff looked back at Boone, and in that look, something shifted. Not trust, not yet. Trust was a structure that required time and evidence to build, and they had neither. But the first fracture appeared in a wall built from fear and maintained by habit. A crack thin enough to be invisible from a distance, but wide enough for light to pass through. Sparrow stepped forward, pulling off her helmet. Her red hair was plastered to her head with sweat, and her face was streaked with soot, but her eyes held a clarity forged by years of making decisions in emergency rooms where hesitation cost lives. "I am a registered nurse," she said. 4 years trauma, 3 years emergency room. Flint is a volunteer firefighter in Sacramento. Diesel has heavy equipment certification. We are not asking to stay. We are asking to be useful. Holbrook's radio erupted with overlapping emergencies. A family stranded on Miller Road with a disabled vehicle. Elderly residents at the Sunset Care Facility still awaiting transport. Reports of the fire spotting across Highway 88 threatening to cut off the eastern evacuation road entirely. The sound of a man's resources being overwhelmed by the scale of what he faced. The smoke thickened around them. The fire roared closer. Ash fell in the space between the sheriff and the biker like snow in a world without winter. And Pine Ridge held its breath, waiting to learn what kind of story this would become. Sheriff Cade Holbrook made his decision the way Marines made decisions, fast and final, with the understanding that hesitation killed more people than bad choices ever did. "The nursing home," he said, "Sunset Care 2 blocks east. 37 residents, most with mobility issues. The transport buses are stuck in traffic south of here. We need to move them now or they don't make it out." He said it to Boone Crandall, but his eyes swept across the assembled bikers, measuring them as he had once measured his squad before a patrol. Calculating capacity, assessing risk, running the cold arithmetic of survival against the dwindling clock. Boone turned to his crew and began assigning roles with the calm authority of a man who had coordinated complex operations before, though never under circumstances quite like these. His voice carried over the rumble of idling engines and the deeper, more ominous rumble of the fire consuming the northern ridge. "Flint, you're with the sheriff. Coordinate evacuation priorities and routes. Diesel, take Torque and 2 bikes to Miller Road. Family stranded with a disabled vehicle. Get them moving south. Sparrow, you and Dove and Canvas come with me to the nursing home. Medical assessment first. The rest of you spread out. Every street, every house. Knock on doors. If someone's still in there, get them out." The bikers moved with the synchronized efficiency of people who had spent years operating as a unit. Within 60 seconds, they had dispersed across Pine Ridge, like fingers spreading from a fist, each one carrying a specific purpose into the chaos. Elaine stood beside her car and watched them go. Then she looked at Boone, who was mounting his bike to ride the 2 blocks to Sunset Care, and she made her own decision. "I'm coming with you," she said. Boone looked at her. His smoke-reddened eyes held a question he did not ask out loud. "You'll need someone they trust," Elaine said. "Those nurses don't know you. Those patients don't know you. But they know me. I've been bringing pies to that place for 20 years. Boone held her gaze for a single beat, then nodded. "Get on." Elaine had not ridden on a motorcycle in her entire 60 years of life. She climbed onto the back of Boone Crandall's Harley-Davidson with the graceless determination of a woman who understood that dignity was a luxury she could not presently afford, gripping the seat with her thighs and holding onto the back of his leather vest with fingers that left permanent impressions in the leather. The bike surged forward through the ash-filled street with a power that vibrated through her bones and made her teeth ache, and her stomach lurch, and the wind carried smoke and heat against her face with the intimacy of something trying to know her. She thought of Frank. He would have laughed. He would have said Elaine Whitfield on a Harley-Davidson. "Well, I have now seen everything," and she would have told him to hush and hold on tighter. 2 blocks had never felt so long or so short. Sunset Care Assisted Living was a single-story facility built in the 1990s, a sprawling beige building with a covered entrance and a parking lot that was currently empty of everything except a maintenance van and a sedan that belonged to the head nurse. The American flag on the pole out front hung limp in the smoke-heavy air, barely visible through the haze. The transport buses that were supposed to evacuate the residents were somewhere on Highway 49, trapped in the same gridlock that was choking every road out of Pine Ridge. Inside the scene was controlled chaos. Nurses moved between rooms with the frantic energy of people who understood the stakes but did not have the resources to meet them. The hallways smelled of disinfectant and anxiety, and beneath those smells, increasingly of smoke. It was seeping in through the ventilation system, now thin but unmistakable, a reminder that the fire did not respect walls or schedules or the vulnerability of the people behind them. The head nurse was a woman named Ruth Ann, 53 years old, with a composure forged by decades of managing crises in medical settings, now confronting a crisis that fell entirely outside her training. She stood at the main desk with a clipboard pressed to her chest and a phone wedged between her ear and shoulder, arguing with someone about bus dispatch times while 2 aides hovered behind her waiting for instructions she did not have. When Boone walked through the front door in his soot-covered leather vest with his Hell's Angels patches visible in the fluorescent light, Ruth Ann stopped mid-sentence. She lowered the phone. She stared at him and then at Sparrow and Dove and Canvas filing in behind him, and then at Elaine, who was the last through the door, breathing hard from the motorcycle ride and the smoke and the accumulated weight of everything this day had already demanded of her. Ruth Ann's expression cycled through recognition, confusion, and a visible internal calculation that ended with her mouth opening but no words coming out. Ruth Ann, Elaine said, stepping forward. She put her hand on the nurse's arm, a gesture of connection, of familiarity, of trust transferred through physical contact. "These people are here to help. They're the ones who just brought 3 families through the fire from Crystal Creek. The sheriff sent them. We need to move all 37 residents, and we need to do it now." Ruth Ann looked at the patches, looked at Elaine, looked at the smoke wisping through the ventilation grate above the desk. "I have 4 staff," she said. 4. Mrs. Dunlap called in sick, and the evening shift hasn't arrived because they're evacuating their own families. "I have 37 residents, 12 of whom can't walk unassisted, 3 on oxygen, 1 recovering from a stroke, and 1 with advanced dementia who becomes violent when his routine is disrupted. I have no buses, no ambulances, and the fire department hasn't returned my calls in 40 minutes. Her voice cracked on the last word, and Elaine saw the woman beneath the professional composure. Terrified, overwhelmed, holding together by will alone. Sparrow stepped forward. She had pulled a notebook from inside her vest, and when she spoke, her voice carried the crisp, focused authority of someone who had spent 7 years in emergency rooms, where this tone was the difference between order and catastrophe. "I need names and medical conditions," she said. "Critical patients first, who cannot be moved without medical support." Ruth Ann stared at Sparrow's vest patches, then at her face. She looked at the notebook, at the pen poised and ready, at the eyes that held no hesitation and no pretense. And Ruth Ann made a decision that Elaine would later describe as the bravest thing she witnessed that day, braver even than running into a burning building. She chose to trust capability over appearance. She chose to see the nurse behind the leather instead of the leather in front of the nurse. She began rattling off names and conditions with the rapid-fire efficiency of a medical professional who had been holding this information in her head for hours waiting for someone competent enough to receive it. Mr. Hartwell, room 12. Oxygen dependency. OPD. Cannot walk more than 10 steps without assistance. Mrs. Thurston, room 8. Recent stroke, left side paralysis, limited mobility. Mr. Waverly, room 15. Advanced dementia, becomes aggressive and combative when confused or removed from familiar surroundings. Mrs. Langford, room 22. 91 years old, legally blind, ambulatory, but requires a guide. Mr. Ostrowski, room 9. Bilateral knee replacement. 3 months ago, uses a walker, very slow. Sparrow wrote each name with rapid precision, organizing the evacuation into tiers. She assigned each critical patient to a Hells Angels member with specific instructions that demonstrated a depth of medical knowledge no one in that hallway expected from a woman in a leather vest. Canvas, she said to the young artist, you have Mr. Waverly. Dementia patients respond to calm, consistent voices. Do not correct him if he says something confused. Do not argue. Agree with everything. If he thinks you are his son, you are his son. If he thinks it is 1975, it is 1975. Keep your voice low and even. Do not rush him. Canvas nodded. He had put away his sketch pad and his face held a quiet seriousness that made him look older than his 25 years. Dove Sparrow continued. Mrs. Thurston in room 8. Stroke recovery, left side weakness. Support her on the left. She may not be able to grip with her left hand, so do not rely on her holding on to you. You hold on to her. Dove moved toward room 8 without a word. Her kind eyes had hardened into focus, and the tenderness that Elaine had noticed in the diner was still there, but channeled now, directed, purposeful. Boone took Mr. Hartwell, the oxygen-dependent patient. He disconnected the large stationary oxygen unit and connected the portable tank with hands that were surprisingly deft for their size, checking the flow rate and ensuring the nasal cannula was secure before lifting the elderly man from his chair with the careful strength of someone who understood that fragility and dignity were inseparable. Elaine worked the hallway alongside Ruth Ann and the remaining staff, moving from room to room, explaining to frightened residents what was happening and why they needed to leave. Some of them knew her. Mrs. Langford, the blind woman, recognized her voice immediately. Elaine Whitfield, she said, reaching out with both hands. Is that you? What's happening? I smell smoke. We're going on a little trip, Mrs. Langford. Just for a few days. Let me help you pack your bag. The woman gripped Elaine's arm with fingers that were thin but fierce. I don't want to leave my room. I know. But your room will be here when you get back. Right now, I need you to trust me. Mrs. Langford held on tighter, and Elaine guided her into the hallway with the patience of someone who understood that for a 91-year-old blind woman, being removed from the only space she could navigate by memory was its own kind of catastrophe, smaller than fire but no less real. In room 15, Canvas was working a small miracle. Mr. Waverly, 84 years old, had been standing in the corner of his room in his bathrobe, his face contorted with confusion, and the beginning stages of agitation that Ruth Ann had warned could escalate to violence. He was a large man even at 84, broad through the shoulders with thick forearms that spoke of decades of physical labor. In his lucid moments, he was gentle and polite. In his confused moments, he was dangerous. Canvas stood in the doorway, making no move to enter the room. He spoke in a voice so low and calm it barely carried into the hallway. Morning, Dad, Canvas said. Time for breakfast. Mom's got the car running. Mr. Waverly blinked. The confusion on his face shifted, reorganized, settled into something that looked like recognition, even though it was not. His hands unclenched. His shoulders dropped. Breakfast, he repeated. Yeah, pancakes today. Your favorite. Come on, I'll walk you out. Mr. Waverly crossed the room and took Canvas's arm with the trusting ease of a man who believed he was walking to breakfast with his son, and Canvas guided him down the hallway with a gentleness that made Ruth Ann stop and stare, and then turn away quickly, pressing the back of her hand against her mouth. Outside, the remaining bikers had begun arriving with vehicles commandeered from the evacuation staging area. Pickup trucks, SUVs, anything large enough to transport multiple passengers. They loaded residents with meticulous care, securing wheelchairs, ensuring oxygen tanks were stable, helping ambulatory patients into seats with the kind of physical support that required both strength and sensitivity. Elaine stood at the facility's front entrance, directing traffic like an air traffic controller, on a runway, coordinating which vehicle took which patient, ensuring that medical needs were matched with available equipment, keeping a running count in her head that she checked against Ruth Ann's clipboard every few minutes. 37 residents, 4 staff members, 12 bikers, 1 diner owner who had not planned to spend her Monday afternoon managing the evacuation of a nursing home, but was doing it anyway because someone had to, and she was there. The last resident was Opal Kingsley, room 27. Opal was 92 years old. She sat in a wheelchair by her window watching the smoke darken the sky with an expression of resigned familiarity that did not match the terror on every other face in the building. She was thin and straight-backed, with white hair pinned in a precise bun and hands folded in her lap with a stillness that said she had learned long ago that panic accomplished nothing. When Elaine entered her room, Opal looked up with clear blue eyes that held more history than most libraries. "Fire," she said, not a question. "Yes, ma'am. We need to go." Opal nodded once, crisp and decisive. "During the war, I served as a nurse at a field hospital 30 miles behind the front lines. We evacuated that hospital twice. Once under artillery fire." She paused, studying Elaine with the shrewd assessment of someone who had spent 92 years evaluating people and had gotten very good at it. "I survived worse than fire in my life, young lady. Help me with my coat and let's go." Elaine helped her into a heavy wool cardigan that seemed absurd in August heat, but which Opal insisted upon with the authority of a woman who was not accustomed to being contradicted. As they moved through the hallway, Opal's wheelchair pushed by one of the aides, the old woman reached up and gripped Elaine's hand. "Those men in the leather," Opal said. She had been watching through her window as the bikers loaded patients into vehicles. "They're good men, I can tell. I spent 4 years sorting the good from the bad in conditions that stripped away every disguise. You learn to see the truth when the pretending stops. Those men are the real thing." Elaine squeezed her hand and said nothing because nothing needed to be said. By 12:15, all 37 residents of Sunset Care had been loaded into vehicles and dispatched south toward the evacuation route. Ruth Ann stood in the empty parking lot, her clipboard clutched to her chest, tears streaming down her face in 2 clean lines through the ash on her cheeks. "Thank you," she said to Sparrow, who was the last biker still on site. "I don't know what we would have done." Sparrow put a hand on her shoulder. "You would have figured it out. People always do when it matters." The air had thickened in the time it took to empty the nursing home. The smoke was no longer a haze, but a presence, a physical thing that pressed against the skin and filled the lungs with each breath. Through it, Elaine could see the fire on the ridge above town, closer now. Individual flames visible among the trees, like the fingers of an enormous hand reaching down the mountainside toward everything she loved. Boone pulled his motorcycle alongside Elaine. His face was dark with exertion and soot, and the lines around his eyes had deepened in the last hour, carved by smoke and urgency. "We need to move to the staging area," he said. "Help with the main evacuation." Elaine nodded. She was about to speak when she heard it, a sound that cut through the smoke and the fire's roar and the mechanical noise of evacuation with the precision of a blade. A woman screaming, not a scream of pain or surprise, a scream of absolute primal terror. The sound a mother makes when she cannot find her child and the world is burning. The scream came from the direction of Pinneridge Elementary 2 blocks north. Boone's head snapped toward the sound. Flint and Canvas, who had returned from their assignments, were already swinging their bikes around. Elaine did not think. She ran. She ran toward the sound with her 60-year-old legs carrying her faster than they had moved in decades, her lungs burning with smoke and exertion, her heart hammering against her ribs with the force of a fist pounding on a locked door. They found Jolene Mercer in the school parking lot. She was a small woman, early 30s, with brown hair pulled back in a ponytail that had come loose on one side, and she was standing beside a minivan with both doors open, screaming a name into the smoke with everything her body could produce. Her younger daughter, maybe 3 years old, was strapped in her car seat in the back, wailing in response to her mother's terror, feeding on it the way children feed on every emotion the adults around them broadcast. The name she screamed was Caleb. Jolene saw them coming and surged forward, grabbing at Elaine's arm, at Boone's vest. It hit anyone solid enough to anchor her to the moment. "My son," she gasped. "Caleb. He's 7. He has asthma. I came back for his inhaler." She held up the small device, gripping it so tightly her knuckles were bloodless. "He needs this. He can't breathe without it. But when I came out of the house, he was gone from the car. He gets scared. He runs and hides when he's scared. The school. He goes to school here. He must have run inside, but the doors are locked, and I can't find him. and I can't get in, and I can't hear him, and please, please, you have to help me find him." The words poured out in a single breathless torrent, and Elaine absorbed them with the practiced calm of a woman who had spent 32 years behind a counter listening to people in every state of human emotion. She took Jolene's hands, held them firmly, made eye contact, and did not look away. "We will find him," she said. "Tell me exactly how long he has been missing." Jolene's face crumpled, then reconstructed itself through sheer force of maternal will. 10 minutes, maybe 15. I've been calling and calling, but he doesn't answer. When he's scared, he goes quiet. He hides and goes quiet. The school loomed before them, a single-story building, brick and glass, that housed 200 students during the academic year, but now stood dark and empty, evacuated hours ago, and locked against entry. Through the smoke, they could see the fire on the ridge above, close enough now to make out individual flames, close enough to feel the radiant heat pressing against exposed skin like standing in front of an open furnace, close enough that the sound of it, that freight train roar, drowned out everything except shouted words and screaming mothers. Elaine turned to Boone, and what happened next would stay with her for the rest of her life. She watched his face change, not a shift in response to bad news or sudden shock. Something deeper, something older. The color drained from beneath the soot and sunburn, and his eyes went somewhere far away for a single terrible second. Somewhere 18 years in the past. Somewhere a 9-year-old girl named Lillian was trapped in a burning house, while her father was too far away to reach her in time. Elaine stepped close. Close enough that only he could hear her over the fire's roar. Close enough to see the pulse hammering in his throat and his hands trembling at his sides. "She was 9, Elaine said. Her voice was quiet and steady and held no judgment, only understanding. "He is 7. Go get him." Boone's eyes came back from wherever they had gone. He looked at Elaine, and in that look she saw a man confronting the worst moment of his life, not as a memory, but as a second chance. Not as repetition, but as redemption. The fire had taken his daughter because he was not there. Now the fire was threatening someone else's child, and he was standing right here, and the door was right there, and this time he was not too far away. "How do you know about that?" he said. Not angry, just raw. A question stripped of every defense. "It does not matter how I know," Elaine said. "What matters is what you do in the next 10 minutes. Boone Crandall turned toward the school. Whatever had been trembling in him went still. His shoulders squared, his jaw set. He was not the same man he had been 3 seconds ago. He was the man he had spent 18 years wishing he could have been on the night his daughter died. "Torque," he called. The stocky mechanic was already at the school's front door examining the lock. "Get us in." 30 seconds, Torque said, producing tools from inside his vest, with the fluid ease of a man who had been opening things his entire life. "Flint, you're with me," Boone said. "Canvas fall in. We go room by room, fast and systematic. Check every closet, every cabinet, every space a scared kid would hide." He looked at Sparrow. "Medical assessment the second we bring him out." Sparrow was already setting up. She had procured an oxygen kit from the nursing home supplies, and her hands moved with the automatic precision of muscle memory as she prepared for a pediatric smoke inhalation case. "You have 10 minutes maximum before smoke concentration becomes lethal at ground level," she said. "For a child with asthma, possibly less. Do not waste time." Torque had the door open in 20 seconds. The lock surrendered with a metallic snap, and smoke poured out of the gap like breath from a living thing. Not thick, not yet, but present and growing and carrying with it the acrid smell of a building, absorbing the fire's approach through every vent and crack and seam. Boone pulled his bandana over his nose and mouth. Flint and Canvas did the same. Then they disappeared into the building, swallowed by the gray interior, their bootsteps echoing off linoleum floors and cinder block walls before fading into silence. Elaine stayed with Jolene and Sparrow in the parking lot. She held Jolene's hand and spoke to her in the same voice she used when frightened customers came into the diner during storms, steady and warm, and certain even when certainty was a performance rather than a fact. She told Jolene that the men who had just gone inside had ridden through a wildfire to get here. She told her they had evacuated 37 elderly patients from a nursing home in under an hour. She told her they would find Caleb because finding people in danger was what they did, even when the world told them they were the danger. In the back seat, the 3-year-old girl had stopped wailing and was now hiccuping, quietly exhausted by her own terror. 1 minute passed, 2. Elaine counted the seconds with the same precision She counted change at the register precisely, and without allowing her mind to wander toward what each second meant for a 7-year-old boy with asthma trapped in a building filling with smoke. She held Jolene's hand and she counted and she watched the school's entrance for movement. 3 minutes. 4. The fire's roar had grown louder. Through the smoke, Elaine could see embers drifting through the air like malevolent fireflies carried on thermals from the burning ridge. Some of them landed on the school's flat roof and glowed there briefly before dying. But it would not be long before they found something to catch, something to feed, and then the school itself would become part of the fire's meal. 5 minutes. 6. Sparrow checked her watch. Her face was a mask of professional composure, but Elaine saw the tension in her jaw, her fingers drumming against the oxygen tank with increasing speed. Sheriff Holbrook arrived. He got out of his patrol car and took in the situation with a single sweep, and his face went through something that Elaine would remember long after the fire was out and the town was rebuilt. She watched a hard man confront the limits of his hardness. She watched him understand that every resource was deployed, every person committed, and there was nothing he could add to what was already happening, except his presence and his hope. 7 minutes. Jolene had stopped screaming. She stood rigid, her eyes fixed on the school entrance, her body vibrating with a tension so extreme that Elaine could feel it transmitted through their clasped hands. She was a mother waiting to learn if she was still a mother, and there was no preparation for that. No training, no experience that could make those seconds pass at any speed other than geological. 8 minutes. Movement at the door, a shape in the smoke. Boone Crandall emerged from the building carrying Caleb Mercer against his chest. The boy's face was buried in the biker's neck. His small arms locked around Boone's shoulders with the desperate grip of a child who had decided that this large, terrifying stranger was the safest thing in a world that had become nothing but smoke and fear. Flint and Canvas flanked them both, coughing hard, their faces blackened beyond recognition, their eyes streaming. Sparrow moved immediately. She took Caleb from Boone with practiced hands, laid him on a blanket she had spread on the asphalt, checked his airway, his breathing, his pulse. She administered oxygen from the portable tank, fitting the small mask over his face with the gentle firmness of someone who had done this 1,000 times but never stopped caring about doing it right. Jolene collapsed to her knees beside her, son sobbing with the full-body convulsions of relief so intense, it was physically indistinguishable from grief. She reached for Caleb, touched his hair, his face, his hands confirming with every sense she possessed that he was real and alive and breathing. He was in the art supply closet, Boone rasped. He had bent double hands on his knees, coughing smoke from lungs that had absorbed too much. Elaine brought him water from Jolene's minivan, and he drank in long, desperate gulps. Smart kid, he managed between coughs. Knew to stay low, curled up under the sink where the air was still clean. Another few minutes and it wouldn't have been. Another few minutes. The words hung in the air between them, like the smoke itself carrying the weight of what had almost happened. What would have happened if 3 men in leather vests had not run into a building that everyone else had abandoned? Caleb coughed weakly beneath the oxygen mask. Then he opened his eyes and looked up at Boone, who was still bent over, still coughing, still wearing the hellsangels patches that the boy's parents had warned him about his entire short life. The boy's eyes were red-rimmed and glassy with smoke and tears, but they were open and focused and alive. "You're one of the bad guys," Caleb whispered. The words came out thin and reedy through the mask, filtered through the oxygen and the residual wheeze of aggravated asthma. "My dad says you're bad guys." Boone straightened. He looked down at the boy, and Elaine watched the man's face undergo a transformation that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The hardness that decades of road and reputation had built into those features softened into something approaching sadness, but also something approaching peace. "Yeah, kid," Boone said. His voice was rough with smoke and emotion, and the particular vulnerability of a man who had just relived and rewritten the worst moment of his history. "That's what people say. But sometimes bad guys do good things too." Caleb studied him through the mask. His 7-year-old mind was working behind those red-rimmed eyes, processing new information against old assumptions, testing what he had been told against what he had just experienced. 7 is young enough to believe what your parents tell you, and old enough to recognize when the evidence contradicts the lesson. Then he said something that cracked the world open. "I think my dad was wrong about you." 5 words from a child on a parking lot blanket with an oxygen mask on his face and ash in his hair. 5 words that carried more weight than any sermon or speech or editorial, because they came from the only court of judgment that mattered. The court of direct experience. The court of a boy who had been hiding in a closet waiting to die and had been carried out by a man in a leather vest who smelled like smoke and engine oil and something that might have been tears. Boone did not respond. He turned away and Elaine saw him press the heel of his hand against his eyes in a gesture that was quick and fierce and utterly private. She was the only one who saw it. Jolene was bent over Caleb. Sparrow was monitoring vitals. Flint and Canvas were coughing against the side of the building. Sheriff Holbrook stood 3 feet away, with his hand on his radio and his jaw locked against whatever was moving through him. Only Elaine saw Boone Crandall, president of the Hells Angels, weep for 3 seconds in a school parking lot. And she understood that those tears contained 18 years of grief and guilt, and the fragile, astonishing relief of a man who had finally been in the right place at the right time. She did not mention it. She would never mention it. Some moments were too sacred for words, and this was one of them. "We need to move," Holbrook said. His voice was controlled but urgent. "Fires reached the northern blocks. Structures catching on Oakwood Drive. We have maybe 30 minutes to get everyone out." The evacuation became a race measured in blocks and minutes. Boone organized the remaining bikers into a sweep pattern, working south through Pine Ridge Street, by street, knocking on doors, checking homes, searching for anyone still sheltering in place. Flint coordinated with Holbrook's deputies on radio mapping, cleared zones against the fire's advancing edge. Sparrow loaded Jolene and both children into the minivan and sent them south with instructions for the medical staff at the evacuation center in Placerville. Elaine found herself at the center of the civilian evacuation, standing at the main intersection where Highway 49 carried the stream of fleeing vehicles south. The traffic lights had gone dark when the power failed, and without them, the intersection had become a choke point where fear and confusion and mechanical failure conspired to create gridlock at the worst possible moment. She stepped into the intersection. She did not think about it. She did not plan it. She stepped into the center of the crossroads as naturally as she stepped behind her counter every morning, with the automatic authority of a woman who had spent her life managing the flow of people and food and conversation, and she began directing traffic. Her arms moved with clear, decisive gestures. "Stop, go, merge right, wait." She waved pickup trucks through, held up her hand to pause sedans, created gaps for larger vehicles carrying families and pets, and the accumulated possessions of abandoned homes. When a car stalled, she directed traffic around it. When a driver panicked and froze at the wheel, she walked to their window and spoke to them with the same voice she used to calm the diner during thunderstorms, firm and warm and unshakable. Boone saw her from 3 blocks away. He had been clearing the last houses on Maple Street, and when he turned his bike south and saw Elaine Whitfield standing in the middle of the intersection in her diner apron, directing evacuation traffic with the authority of a 5-star general, something crossed his face that looked very much like awe. By 2 o'clock, the last vehicles were leaving Pine Ridge. The fire had consumed the northern edge of town, and through the smoke, Elaine could see flames climbing 60 feet into the air above homes on Oakwood Drive. Homes where people had lived and loved and built their lives, now reduced to fuel for something vast and indifferent. The cemetery where Frank was buried sat just below the ridgeline, and she could not see whether the fire had reached it. She chose not to look too hard. The final convoy formed on Main Street, Sheriff Holbrook's patrol car at the front, civilian vehicles in the middle packed with people and animals and whatever fragments of their lives they had managed to carry. And at the rear, 12 motorcycles in formation, their engines growling beneath the fire's roar like a defiant answer to destruction. Every resident accounted for, every nursing home patient transported, every holdout persuaded or carried or driven to safety by strangers in leather vests who had no obligation to any of them. Elaine climbed into her sedan with Dottie beside her. Dottie, who had not left when Elaine told her to, who had driven 2 blocks south before turning around and coming back because 15 years of loyalty overrode self-preservation. She had walked into Sunset Care without explanation, taken a clipboard, and spent 2 hours loading patients and distributing water with a quiet competence that surprised them both. The convoy began to move south on Highway 49, a slow-moving river of headlights and taillights crawling through smoke so thick that the car ahead was little more than a red glow in the murk. Elaine drove with both hands locked on the wheel, following those taillights the way a sailor follows a lighthouse, trusting that the light ahead meant safety, even when nothing else was visible. Dottie sat beside her, gripping the armrest. For 40 minutes they crawled south. The smoke pressed against the windows. The temperature inside the car climbed despite the air conditioning. Through the haze, Elaine could see families in adjacent vehicles, children's faces pressed against glass, staring out at a world that had become alien and terrifying. Elderly passengers slumped against headrests, exhausted beyond endurance. Dogs panting in back seats. A cat carrier balanced on someone's lap. 3,847 people, minus no one plus evacuees from Crystal Creek and Timber Falls, and a dozen other small communities that had emptied into Pine Ridge before Pine Ridge itself had to run. At 2:45, the convoy stopped. The brake lights ahead of Elaine lit up in a chain reaction, and the river of vehicles went still. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Holbrook's voice came over the radio that someone had tuned to the emergency frequency. "We have a situation. Fire has jumped the highway 2 miles ahead. Road is blocked. Hold your positions while we assess alternate routes." Elaine's hands tightened on the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. She looked in her rearview mirror and saw the orange glow behind them, the fire-consuming Pine Ridge growing larger and closer even as they sat motionless on a 2-lane highway with nowhere to go. In the car beside her, a woman was holding a baby against her shoulder, patting its back in the automatic rhythm of motherhood, her face blank with a numbness that arrives when fear exceeds the brain's capacity to process it. Ahead, a man had gotten out of his truck and was standing on the road staring north into the smoke as though he could see through it to the answer that would save them all. They were trapped. 3,000 people on a road that led into fire ahead and fire behind, with dense forest on both sides, in the afternoon wind pushing everything toward them with the relentless patience of something that had all the time in the world, because time was the one thing fire never ran out of. Dottie reached across and gripped Elaine's arm. Her face was pale beneath the ash. Her eyes held the raw terror of someone who had just realized that the worst-case scenario she had been trying not to imagine was the scenario they were living. "What do we do, Elaine?" Elaine looked at the stopped vehicles stretching ahead into the smoke. She looked in the mirror at the vehicles behind her. She thought about the children in those cars, the elderly in those trucks, the 37 nursing home patients somewhere ahead, and the convoy patients she had personally helped load into vehicles just hours ago. She opened her car door and stepped out into the smoke. "We organize," she said, "and we wait for someone to find us another way out." The motorcycles appeared within minutes, weaving between the stopped vehicles like threading needles through fabric. Boone pulled alongside her window, his face grim beneath fresh layers of soot. "We're going ahead to scout alternate routes," he said. "Flint knows these mountains from firefighting. If there's a way through, we'll find it." Elaine looked at him. At the man who had already ridden through fire once today, who had pulled a dying child from a smoke-filled building, who had evacuated 37 elderly patients, and who was now proposing to ride deeper into a burning mountain range to find a road that might not exist. "Be careful," she said. Boone almost smiled. Almost. The ghost of it crossed his face and vanished. He accelerated forward with 5 other bikers. Flint, Sparrow, Torque, Diesel, and Canvas. The remaining 6 stayed with the convoy, moving up and down the line, distributing water bottles, checking on families, offering their bodies as shields between the convoy and the encroaching fire. Elaine did not wait for Boone to find a route. She walked the convoy. Car by car, window by window, she moved through the smoke with her diner apron still tied around her waist, checking on people as though they were customers during a long Sunday brunch. She organized water distribution using bottles scavenged from a delivery truck 3 vehicles back. She moved elderly passengers from cars without air conditioning into vehicles that had it. She sent 3 teenagers to walk the line carrying blankets for those who needed them and information for those who craved it. She transformed a panicked convoy into a community. The same skills she had used for 32 years behind her counter applied on a larger scale under circumstances that would have broken most people into pieces. 20 minutes passed. 30. The smoke grew thicker and the orange glow to the east intensified. Dove the biker with kind eyes appeared beside a woman who had stumbled out of her car, gasping, overwhelmed by smoke and panic. Dove caught her, eased her to the ground, checked her breathing, gave her water, and a respirator mask produced from somewhere inside that seemingly bottomless vest. Elaine watched. She had served this woman breakfast 24 hours ago. She had been frightened of her patches and her leather and the name on her vest. Now she was watching her save a stranger's life with the same tenderness you would show a child. The radio crackled. Sheriff Boone's voice came through rough with smoke and urgency. "We found a route. Old logging road half-mile ahead on the west side. Hasn't been used in years, but it's passable. connects to County Road 12, which links back to Highway 49, about 8 miles south of the blockage. Holbrook's response was immediate and skeptical. That road has been closed for a decade. It's not maintained. Half the bridges are probably out. We checked, Boone said. Bridges are solid. Road is rough but passable for vehicles. It is our only option unless you want to sit here and wait for the fire to reach us. Static on the radio, silence in the convoy. 3,000 people holding their breath in their vehicles, while a sheriff and a biker negotiated their survival over an emergency frequency. Elaine reached through her window and took the radio from the dashboard mount where Dottie had been monitoring it. She had never used an emergency radio in her life. She pressed the transmit button with the certainty that the tool would work because the alternative was unthinkable. Sheriff, it's Elaine Whitfield. Sitting here is certain death. That road is uncertain. I will take uncertain every time. Her voice carried across the frequency and into every vehicle that had tuned in, which by now was most of them. 3,000 people heard a 60-year-old diner owner summarize the only rational choice available in 9 words that left no room for debate. More static. A pause that lasted 3 heartbeats. Then Holbrook's voice stripped of everything except the raw calculation of a man whose options had been reduced to bad and worse. Copy that, we're moving. Boone, stay at the junction and direct traffic. Everyone, we're taking the logging road. Follow the vehicle ahead of you. Do not stop for any reason. The logging road was not a road. It was a memory of a road, a scar through the forest that time and weather and 10 years of neglect had reduced to something barely wider than a hiking trail. Ruts deep enough to swallow a tire cut through the packed earth at irregular intervals. Branches hung low across the path, scraping roofs and slapping windshields with the indifference of a forest that had long since reclaimed what humans had carved through it. Rocks jutted from the surface like broken teeth. Mud pooled in depressions where creeks had overflowed and receded, leaving behind soil, the consistency of wet clay that grabbed at tires and refused to let go. Elaine's sedan bounced over the first rut so hard her head struck the ceiling. Dottie grabbed the dashboard with both hands and made a sound that was half prayer and half profanity. Behind them, the convoy stretched into the smoke, vehicle after vehicle turning off the paved highway and committing themselves to this narrow, treacherous path through burning forest because the alternative was no alternative at all. Boone and the bikers who had scouted the route had doubled back to guide the convoy onto the logging road, and now they repositioned themselves along its length like sentinels, their motorcycles parked at critical points where the terrain was worst, their arms directing traffic with clear practice gestures. At the first creek crossing, where water ran 6 inches deep over a gravel bed, Diesel stood waist deep in the current, guiding each vehicle across with hand signals and shouted instructions. His legs were braced against the flow, his boots planted on the rocky bottom, and he had been standing there for 20 minutes without complaint, without rest, without any indication that he intended to move until the last car had passed. The convoy crawled forward. 1 mile per hour, sometimes less, each vehicle navigating each obstacle independently while the bikers moved between them, solving problems as they arose with the improvisational skill of people who had spent their lives on roads that most people would never travel. A minivan bottomed out on a rock with a sound like a gunshot, sparks flying from the undercarriage. Torque was there in seconds, dropping to his knees in the mud, examining the damage with a flashlight held between his teeth. The oil pans dented but intact, he called up to the driver, a terrified young father with 2 small children in the back seat. "Keep moving. Don't stop." An elderly couple's sedan stalled in the second creek crossing water, rising to the door, seals the engine coughing and dying with a finality that made the woman in the passenger seat begin to cry. Diesel waded to the driver's door, opened it, and spoke to the man behind the wheel with calm authority. "Put it in neutral. I'm going to push you through." And he did, bracing his shoulder against the trunk and driving his legs through the current until the car rolled up onto the far bank where Canvas was waiting to help the couple out and into another vehicle. A pickup truck blew a tire on a jagged rock with a sound that echoed through the trees like a rifle shot. Torque had it changed in under 5 minutes, his hands moving with the efficiency of a man who had performed roadside repairs in every condition the American highway system could produce. He did not speak while he worked. He did not need to. His hands knew the language of lug nuts and tire irons the way a pianist's hands knew keys. When a family station wagon got wedged between 2 boulders that had rolled onto the road, 4 bikers dismounted and physically lifted the rear end. And while the driver gunned the engine, The car lurched free, spraying them with mud and gravel and exhaust, and they did not flinch or curse or pause. They simply wiped their faces and moved to the next crisis. Elaine drove through it all with her jaw set and her hands aching on the wheel and her suspension making sounds that no sedan was designed to produce. Beside her, Dottie had stopped speaking entirely. She sat with her eyes closed and her lips moving in what Elaine recognized as the Lord's Prayer, repeated on a loop, a woman finding the only solid ground available when the literal ground beneath them was trying to shake them apart. 40 minutes into the logging road, they encountered the worst obstacle. A massive oak tree, dead from the drought that had spent 5 years killing everything with roots in this forest, had fallen across the road. Its trunk was enormous, easily 4 feet in diameter, and it lay across the narrow track like a barricade placed there by something deliberate and cruel. The root ball had torn a crater in the earth on one side. The crown had crashed into the dense forest on the other, creating a wall of dead branches that no vehicle could navigate around. There was no alternate path. The forest pressed in on both sides, thick with undergrowth and fallen timber, impassable to anything wider than a person on foot. Behind the tree, 3,000 people waited. Behind those 3,000 people, the fire followed. Sheriff Holbrook stopped his patrol car and got out. He stared at the fallen oak with the expression of a man confronting the physical manifestation of every worst-case scenario he had ever imagined. Behind him, the convoy stretched back into the smoke, an impossibly long line of vehicles containing every person he had sworn to protect. And between them and safety lay 4 feet of dead wood that might as well have been 400. "We need a chainsaw," someone said from one of the nearby vehicles, a man's voice shaking with frustration and fear. "That will take hours to clear by hand." Diesel was already off his bike. He walked around the tree, slowly examining it from every angle, with the practiced eye of someone who understood weight and force and the structural properties of wood as intimately as most people understood their own kitchen. He ran his hand along the bark, pressed his thumb into a soft spot, knocked on the trunk, and listened to the sound it produced. "Not a chainsaw," he said. His voice was calm and certain. "We need leverage. The trunk is rotten through the center. See how it cracked when it fell? The heartwood is gone, eaten by beetles and moisture. This tree is hollow where it matters. We can break it apart if we apply force to the right point." "With what?" Holbrook asked. The frustration in his voice was not directed at Diesel, but at the universe that had placed this obstacle in the path of 3,000 fleeing people. Diesel looked at the 12 motorcycles, then at the tree, then back at the motorcycles. He was calculating. Elaine could see it in his face, the mental arithmetic of a man who understood machines and physics and the alchemy of converting horsepower into salvation. 12 bikes, he said, heavy chain, basic physics. We pulled together at the weak point and the trunk snaps. It was audacious, possibly insane, but they were standing on an abandoned logging road in a burning forest with 3,000 people behind them and an impassable tree in front of them, and the window between survival and catastrophe was measured in minutes. There was no time for better ideas. There was only time for the idea in front of them, however improbable it seemed. Torque produced a chain from his saddlebag. Industrial grade. The kind used for towing heavy vehicles, thick steel links that weighed more than most people wanted to carry, but that bikers with saddlebags designed for long-distance riding considered standard equipment. He and Diesel wrapped it around the tree at the point where the rot was worse, the spot where Diesel's knuckle knock had produced a hollow sound instead of a solid one. They looped the other end through a complex configuration that distributed the load across all 12 motorcycles, each bike connected to the one beside it, forming a single unit of combined horsepower aimed at a single point of weakness. All 12 Hell's Angels mounted their bikes. The engines roared to life in sequence, a cascade of mechanical thunder that rolled through the forest and momentarily drowned even the fire's roar. Boone sat at the center of the line, his hands on his handlebars, his eyes on the chain. On 3, he called over the engine noise. Slow and steady. We pull together or we don't pull at all. Nobody guns it. Nobody heroes. Synchronized, like we ride. 1, 2, 3. 12 motorcycles engaged their gears and began to pull. The chain went taut with a metallic groan that vibrated through the air. The tree resisted. 4 feet of oak, even rotten oak, did not yield easily. For a long moment, nothing happened except the sound of engines straining and chain links protesting and 12 riders fighting the inertia of something that did not want to move. Then a crack, sharp and sudden like a rifle shot. The trunk split along its rotted core. A fissure opened in the wood running lengthwise through the heartwood that beetles and moisture had spent years hollowing. The bikers maintained pressure steady and synchronized 12 engines pulling as one, and the fissure widened. Wood fibers screamed and snapped. Bark peeled away in long strips. And slowly and possibly, the massive trunk began to break apart. Within 5 minutes, they had created a gap wide enough for vehicles to pass. The two halves of the trunk lay on either side of the road, like the parted halves of something biblical. And through the gap, the logging road continued south toward County Road 12 in safety. The convoy moved through one vehicle at a time, while the bikers stayed at the gap, directing traffic, helping vehicles navigate the tight space between the broken halves of the tree. Elaine stopped her car beside Boone as she passed, rolling down her window. His face was streaked with sweat and soot, and the deep exhaustion of a man who had been running on adrenaline and purpose for 7 hours straight. Why, she said. It was the only word she could manage. The complete question, the why of everything, the why of staying, when he could have run, the why of risking his life for people who had locked their doors when they saw him coming, the why that encompassed every decision he and his crew had made since riding out of the smoke that morning. Boone wiped his face with the back of his hand, spreading the grime into new patterns across his weathered skin. He met her eyes, and in his gaze she saw something she had not seen there before. Not sadness, not resignation. Something clearer and simpler and harder to name. "We're just people, ma'am," he said, "and people help each other. That's all." Elaine shook her head slowly. "You are more than that. You are the ones who stayed when you could have run. You are the ones who helped when everyone else was too scared or too busy. That makes you heroes whether you want the word or not." Something moved across his face. Discomfort, maybe, or the unfamiliarity of hearing a word applied to himself that he had never expected to wear. She drove on, through the gap in the tree, down the remaining miles of logging road, until the packed earth gave way to gravel, and the gravel gave way to pavement, and the pavement connected to County Road 12, which wound through untouched forest to rejoin Highway 49, 8 miles south of where the fire had blocked their escape. The convoy emerged from the logging road like water finding an outlet, vehicles spreading onto the paved surface with an almost physical sense of relief. The smoke was thinner here. The sky, while still hazy, held actual color rather than the monochrome orange-gray that had defined the world for the past 8 hours. And ahead, visible through the windshield for the first time since morning, Elaine could see something she had begun to fear she might never see again. Open road, leading south, leading away. They arrived at the emergency shelter in Placerville just after sunset. The sky to the north still glowed orange, but the color was fading, the fire settling into its nighttime behavior as the winds died and the temperature dropped, and the monster that had chased them all day retreated into a slower, more deliberate consumption of everything it had already claimed. The Placerville High School gymnasium had been converted into a refugee camp, its basketball courts covered with rows of cots arranged in military precision, its walls lined with tables where Red Cross volunteers distributed blankets, water, food, and the particular brand of organized compassion that arrived whenever Americans faced disaster. Banners hung from the rafters proclaiming the school's athletic achievements. And there was something painfully ordinary about those banners, those records of normal life hanging above rows of cots, where people lay who had lost their homes and their certainty and the comfortable illusion that the world was a stable place. The parking lot was already half full with vehicles from other evacuated communities, and the sight of it all, those displaced people, all those interrupted lives, all those engines ticking as they cooled in the evening air, gave the scale of the Calera fire a human dimension that no acreage number could convey. As Elaine helped Dottie check in with the registration table, she watched the Hells Angels park their 12 motorcycles in a neat row at the far edge of the parking lot. Even here, even after everything, they positioned themselves at the periphery. Habit, the practiced geometry of people who had learned to occupy the margins because the center had never welcomed them. But they did not rest. Within minutes of arriving, they were working. Sparrow connected with the medical staff and began treating smoke inhalation cases with the calm efficiency of a nurse who had spent 7 years in emergency rooms and could assess a patient's needs in the time it took most people to find a chair. Flint joined the volunteer firefighter coordination team, sharing intelligence about road conditions and fire behavior that he had gathered during the harrowing ride through the logging road. The others simply moved through the gymnasium, doing whatever needed doing, carrying luggage for elderly evacuees, setting up cots for families, distributing supplies, comforting frightened children, with the rough-voiced gentleness of people who understood fear and had learned that the best answer to it was simple physical presence. Caleb Mercer found Boone in the gymnasium crowd. The boy tugged on the biker's leather vest, and Boone looked down at him with an expression that held surprise and something warmer beneath it. "My mom wants to talk to you," Caleb said. His voice was still rough from smoke, and the oxygen mask had left faint red lines on his cheeks, but his eyes were clear and bright, with the resilient certainty of a child who had already reclassified the world's categories. Jolene Mercer stood with her husband Wesley, who had driven from Sacramento the moment he heard about the evacuation, breaking every speed limit between the capital and the foothills, arriving at the shelter to find his family alive and intact and forever changed. Wesley was a thin man with glasses and the careful posture of someone who spent his days at a desk working with numbers, and when he extended his hand to Boone Crandall, his face was working with an emotion that his professional composure could not contain. "I owe you my son's life," Wesley said. His voice broke on the word. Life cracked open by the weight of what that word meant when applied to a 7-year-old boy you had created and raised and nearly lost. "I said terrible things about your people. Told my kids to stay away, that you were dangerous. I was wrong. I am sorry." Boone shook his hand. "No apology needed. Just take care of your boy." But Wesley was not finished. He had the driven intensity of a man who had spent hours driving through smoke and terror toward the possibility that everything he loved had been destroyed, and who had arrived to find it preserved, and who now needed to acknowledge the debt in words precise enough to match its enormity. "You don't understand," Wesley said. "I work in finance. Numbers. Risk assessment. That's what I do for a living. I assess risk, and I assessed you wrong. I looked at the patches and the bikes, and I made assumptions without evidence. That's not just prejudice. That's failed intelligence. And it almost cost me everything." He pulled out his phone and showed Boone a photograph. His family at a park somewhere, Jolene laughing, Caleb on a swing, his hair flying, the 3-year-old daughter sitting in the grass with a dandelion clutched in her fist. A portrait of ordinary happiness, the kind that most people took for granted until the fire came. "This is what you saved today," Wesley said. "Not just my son, my whole family, our whole future. So thank you doesn't begin to cover it, but thank you." Boone accepted it with a nod, uncomfortable with the weight of gratitude, and moved away. But Elaine saw his face before he turned. She saw the jaw tighten. She saw the rapid blink that meant a man was fighting something behind his eyes that he did not want the world to see. Then Caleb pulled a piece of paper from his pocket, folded carefully the way children fold things they consider precious, with the edges lined up and the creases pressed flat by small, deliberate fingers. "I made you something," Caleb said. He held the paper out with both hands, the way you present a gift when the gift matters more to you than anything else you own. Boone took it, unfolded it with hands that were cracked and blistered from the day's work, hands that had gripped handlebars and carried oxygen tanks and pulled a child from smoke and broken a tree in half, and were now holding a piece of lined notebook paper with the gentleness reserved for sacred things. It was a crayon drawing, 12 motorcycles arranged in a circle surrounded by orange and red flames that filled the margins of the page in wild, exuberant strokes. On top of each motorcycle, a stick figure with arms raised above their heads like superheroes. And at the top of the page, in careful 7-year-old handwriting that wobbled on the lines but held firm in its message, 4 words: "You are the good guys." Boone stared at the drawing for a long time. His weathered hands held the paper with a delicacy that seemed impossible for their size, as though it were made of something infinitely fragile and infinitely valuable. Then he folded it with the same care Caleb had used, and he tucked it inside his vest over his heart, in the pocket where it would ride against his chest for every mile of every road he would ever travel again. "Thank you, Caleb," he said quietly. "I will keep this forever." That night, Elaine lay on a Red Cross cot in the gymnasium, exhausted beyond anything she had ever experienced, but unable to sleep. Around her, 3,000 people breathed and shifted and murmured in the restless half-sleep of the displaced. Somewhere a baby cried and was comforted. Somewhere a man coughed deep and wet smoke still working its way out of his lungs. She stared at the ceiling and thought about the day, about the choices that had defined it, about serving breakfast to 12 strangers and searching for information about a man she barely knew, and driving toward a fire she could not fight, And standing in an intersection directing traffic and riding a motorcycle for the first and probably last time in her life, and watching a man carry a child out of a burning building because she had given him the words he needed to walk back into the worst moment of his past. She thought about transformation, not the kind in movies sudden and accompanied by orchestral swells, the real kind, the hard kind that happened when your assumptions met reality and you had to decide which one to keep. 3 days later, the news came. Sheriff Holbrook stood at a makeshift podium in the Placerville High School cafeteria facing a gymnasium full of Pine Ridge residents. Behind him, a projection screen displayed satellite imagery of their town, and the room held the particular silence of people about to learn the fate of everything they owned. The calorifier is now 65% contained, Holbrook began. CAL FIRE crews have been working around the clock, and the weather is finally cooperating. As of 6 this morning, the mandatory evacuation order for Pine Ridge has been lifted. The room exhaled, but Holbrook raised his hand before relief could take hold. However, I need you to understand what you are returning to. The fire burned through the northern edge of town. We lost 43 structures, mostly homes on Oakwood Drive and the surrounding streets. The elementary school sustained significant damage. Several businesses on the northern end of Main Street are gone. He paused. Let the weight of those numbers settle. But downtown is mostly intact. The majority of Pine Ridge survived. Mayor Nora Strickland took the podium as Holbrook stepped aside. She looked like a woman who had aged 5 years in 3 days, but her voice was steady. Before we dismiss, I want to address something publicly. She turned and gestured toward the back of the cafeteria where the hellsangels stood in a loose cluster, separate from the crowd even now. Boone Sparrowflint and your crew, would you please come forward? The 12 bikers exchanged uncertain glances. They moved to the front with the awkward reluctance of people unaccustomed to being called toward attention rather than away from it. Their boots were loud on the linoleum floor, and they stood beside the mayor with their hands at their sides and their faces holding the visible discomfort of being seen. 3 days ago, Nora said, her voice growing stronger, when our town faced the worst crisis in its history, these people who had been in Pine Ridge for less than 24 hours, who had no obligation to us, who had every reason to leave, chose to stay. They evacuated Sunset Care. They pulled Caleb Mercer from a burning building. They scouted the route that saved 3,000 lives. They broke apart a fallen tree that blocked our only escape. She paused and looked out at the assembled residents. I am ashamed to admit that when I saw them in Elaine's diner that Sunday morning, my first instinct was fear. I saw the patches and made assumptions. I believe many of us did. But these people taught us something about judging character over appearance and actions over reputation. The applause began slowly. Earl Pemberton clapping from his seat, his face conflicted, but his hands moving. Then Jolene and Wesley Mercer standing with Caleb between them. Then others, one by one, until the entire cafeteria was on its feet and the sound filled the room like something living and warm. When the applause subsided, Boone stepped to the microphone with the visible discomfort of a man who would rather face another wildfire than a public audience. We appreciate the thanks, he said gruffly, but we are not looking for recognition. We just did what needed doing. Nora shook her head. You were the people we had prejudged and dismissed. That is what makes this matter. You could have left. You should have left, but you stayed. Boone was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke again, and his voice was different. Lower, more honest, stripped of the gruffness he wore like armor. All our lives we have been judged for these patches, he said, touching his vest. For the bikes, the look, the reputation. Most places we go, we are not welcome. People lock their doors, cross the street, call the police. And sometimes we live down to those expectations because why disappoint people who already think the worst of you? He paused. His eyes found Elaine in the third row. But Sunday morning in a diner, a woman named Elaine served us breakfast without judgment, treated us like regular customers, like people. That small act of respect, it matters more than you would think. It reminded us that maybe we are more than what people assume. Maybe we are capable of being better than the reputation we carry. His voice steadied. So we did not stay for recognition. We stayed because someone saw past the patches to the people wearing them. And because people help each other, that is all. The convoy back to Pine Ridge formed that afternoon. Elaine drove through a landscape that bore the fire's signature in every direction. Blackened hillsides stretched to the horizon, the trees reduced to skeletal columns of charcoal standing in rows like monuments to something that had once been alive. Ash covered everything in a gray so uniform it looked like the world had been drained of color and left to dry in the autumn sun. Here and there a green tree stood untouched among its burned neighbors, spared by some caprice of wind or moisture, and these survivors looked more desolate than the burned ones, solitary witnesses to what had been lost around them. The smell came through the car's ventilation despite the closed windows. That particular scent of burned forest, sharp and chemical, and carrying beneath it a deeper note of something organic of soil and root, and the accumulated life of decades reduced to carbon in hours. But when they crested the final hill and Pine Ridge came into view, her heart lifted despite everything. The town stood, damaged, yes, smoke-stained and ash-covered with gaps on the northern side where homes and businesses had been like teeth missing from a familiar smile, but standing, surviving. The water tower still rose above the tree line. The church steeple still pointed at the sky. Main Street still ran straight and true through the center of town, its buildings intact, its sidewalks buried under ash but unbroken. Her diner's neon sign, Elaine's Place, in red cursive, was dark but intact. She parked on Main Street and walked to the front door with Dottie beside her. The windows were filmed with soot. Ash drifted in piles against the threshold. Inside, everything was coated in fine gray dust. The counter, the booths, the photographs on the wall. But it was all there. 32 years of her life waiting for her to come back and bring it to life again. The damage was cosmetic. The structure was sound. The rest was just work, and Elaine Whitfield had never been afraid of work. The Hells Angels motorcycles rumbled down Main Street one final time, pulling to a stop in front of the diner. Boone dismounted and looked at the building, then at Elaine. "Your place made it," he said. "Thanks to you. Thanks to all of you." "We are heading out," Boone said, "back to Sacramento." But he hesitated, and in that hesitation, Elaine heard something she recognized from 32 years of reading people across a counter. A question forming beneath the surface, circling the words it needed, afraid of the answer it might receive. "We ride through this area sometimes," he said. "Would we be welcome to stop in for breakfast?" It was not about breakfast. They both knew that. It was about belonging, about whether the transformation of the past 3 days would hold when the crisis faded, and ordinary life resumed, and people had the luxury of returning to their comfortable prejudices. Boone and Lane said, "You and your crew will always be welcome here, anytime." Something eased in his face. A tension she had not consciously registered released from his shoulders, and for one moment the man behind the patches was fully visible. Not a biker, not a president, not a reputation, just a person who wanted to be told he could come back. He nodded, shook her hand, mounted his bike. 12 engines roared to life and the convoy pulled south. The weeks that followed were consumed with rebuilding. Crews cleared debris from the 43 destroyed homes. The elementary school was assessed, repaired, and eventually reopened. Businesses returned one by one. Elaine cleaned her diner with help from dozens of volunteers who showed up without being asked, scrubbing soot from surfaces and washing smoke from curtains and restoring order to a place that had always been the town's center of gravity. On her first day back open, she hung new additions to the wall of photographs that documented Pine Ridge's history. A picture of the 12 motorcycles lined up in front of her diner that Sunday morning, taken through the window before anyone knew what was coming. Caleb Mercer's crayon drawing mounted in a simple wooden frame, and beside it, protected behind glass, the napkin Boone had left beneath his coffee cup. "Thank you for your kindness. It is rarer than you would think." The town settled back into its rhythms, but not entirely, not the same rhythms as before. Something had shifted in the bedrock of Pine Ridge's identity, and whether that shift would hold was tested 6 weeks after the evacuation at a town council meeting that Elaine would remember as the moment Pine Ridge decided what kind of community it wanted to be. The meeting was held in the community center on a Thursday evening. The agenda was reconstruction priorities, zoning amendments for temporary housing, and a proposal submitted by Earl Pemberton and 7 co-signers requesting that the town council adopt an ordinance restricting organized motorcycle club gatherings within Pine Ridge town limits. Elaine sat in the third row and listened as Earl Pemberton stood at the public comment microphone. He was 74 years old, a lifelong Pine Ridge resident, a veteran, a grandfather, and a man whose fear had survived the fire, even when his gratitude had not. "This is not about what happened during the evacuation," Earl said, adjusting his glasses. "Nobody's saying those bikers didn't help. They did. But one good act doesn't change what these organizations represent. We have families here, children. We need to protect the character of our community. This ordinance simply ensures that large motorcycle club gatherings don't become a regular occurrence in Pine Ridge. He sat down to a smattering of applause from a small cluster of residents who shared his position. The council members, 5 in total, studied their papers with the careful neutrality of elected officials, trying to read the room before committing to a direction. Other speakers followed, some in favor, some opposed, some uncertain. The arguments were familiar: safety, property values, reputation, the comfort of keeping unfamiliar things at a distance. Elaine waited. She let others speak first because she had spent 32 years learning that the most effective voice in a room was often the last one, the one that spoke after everyone else had exhausted their positions and the silence was ready to receive something different. When she stood, the room quieted, not because she demanded it, but because in Pine Ridge, when Elaine Whitfield stood up to speak, people listened. 32 years behind a counter had earned her that. She did not raise her voice. She did not gesture or pound the podium or appeal to emotion with the practiced rhetoric of someone trying to win an argument. She simply told the truth, plainly, specifically, without embellishment. She told them who had evacuated Sunset Care when the buses could not come. She named every biker and what they had done. Canvas talking Mr. Waverly out of his room, Dove carrying Mrs. Pemberton through the hallway, Sparrow organizing triage with the precision of a trauma nurse. She told them who had pulled Caleb Mercer from the art supply closet of Pine Ridge Elementary with 4 minutes of breathable air remaining. She described the smoke and the heat and the 8 minutes that separated a living child from a dead one. She told them who had found the logging road when Highway 49 was burning on both sides, who had broken a 4-foot oak tree with 12 motorcycles in a chain, who had stood in a creek for 20 minutes guiding cars through water while the fire closed in. And she told them who had brought 3 families from Crystal Creek through the fire when the emergency services had written them off. She paused. She looked at Earl Pemberton, who would not meet her eyes. She looked at the council members who were watching her with the focused attention of people who understood they were witnessing the turning point of the meeting. "I understand the fear," Elaine said. "I felt it too that Sunday morning when the 12 motorcycles pulled up to my diner. I saw the leather and the patches, and I felt my stomach tighten. But I served them breakfast anyway. Not because I was brave, because I was raised to believe that you treat people as people first and judge them by their actions, not their appearance." She took a breath. Those people acted when it mattered, when it cost them something, when they had every reason to ride away and let us fend for ourselves. They stayed. They bled for this town. They breathed smoke for this town. They carried our elderly and saved our children and broke their bodies, pulling a tree out of our escape route. Her voice was steady. It had always been steady. 32 years behind a counter, facing down recessions and droughts and the small daily crises of running a business alone, had built a steadiness that nothing could shake. Not fire, not fear, not the familiar tired machinery of prejudice grinding through a town council meeting. "What kind of town are we?" she said. "If we ban the people who saved us, what kind of community passes an ordinance against the hands that carried us to safety? If we do this, we are not protecting Pine Ridge. We are betraying it. We are saying that our comfort matters more than our character, and that the lessons we learned in the fire were not worth keeping." She sat down. The silence that followed was complete. Then Jolene Mercer stood holding Caleb's hand. She did not speak. She did not need to. She simply stood with her son, the boy who was alive, because 3 men in leather vests had run into smoke, and her standing was its own testimony. Then Sheriff Cade Holbrook rose from his seat near the back wall. He had not planned to speak. Elaine could tell from his shifting weight, from how he cleared his throat twice before committing to words. This was not a prepared statement. This was a man deciding in real time that silence was no longer an option. "I was wrong about them," Holbrook said. His voice was flat and direct, the voice of a Marine delivering an honest assessment regardless of whether it reflected well on him. "I treated them as a threat based on their appearance and reputation. That was my training talking, and my training was wrong. They offered help, and it was a civilian, not me, who had the sense to make sure we accepted it." He looked at the council. "This ordinance is wrong. It punishes people for how they look, not what they have done. And in my experience, that kind of law never protects anyone. It just makes the people who pass it feel safer without actually making them safe." He sat down. The council voted 4-1 against the ordinance. Earl Pemberton's proposal died in the community center on a Thursday evening in October. killed by the testimony of a diner owner, the presence of a mother and child, and the honest words of a sheriff who had learned the difference between caution and prejudice on the worst day of his career. The single vote in favor came from a councilwoman who had not been in Pine Ridge during the evacuation, who had been visiting family in Oregon when the fire came and returned to find her town transformed by an experience she had not shared. Elaine did not blame her. You could not understand the fire unless you had stood in its heat. You could not understand the bikers unless you had watched them work. The room dispersed slowly, people gathering in small groups to discuss what had just happened, what it meant, what kind of town they were becoming. Some shook Elaine's hand, others avoided her eyes. The full spectrum of human response to being shown that their comfortable assumptions were wrong, some grateful for the correction, some resentful, most somewhere in between. After the meeting, Earl Pemberton approached Elaine in the parking lot. He stood under the streetlight with his hands in his jacket pockets and his face holding the complicated expression of a man whose convictions had just been publicly defeated by his conscience. The October wind carried the faint smell of char from the burned ridgeline above town, a reminder that the fire's aftermath would linger long after the flames were out. "I was not trying to be ungrateful," he said. "I know, Earl. I have lived here my whole life. Change is hard for me." "Change is hard for everyone," Elaine said. "But the fire changed us, whether we wanted it to or not. The question is whether we change into something better or something worse." Earl stood there for a moment longer. Then he nodded a small, reluctant movement that was not quite agreement, but was no longer opposition. He walked to his car and drove away into the October night, and Elaine watched him go and felt something she had not expected to feel. Compassion for the fear behind the ordinance, for the man behind the fear. Because prejudice was not always malice. Sometimes it was just the sound a frightened heart made when it could not find any other way to feel safe. 6 months later, on a Sunday morning in February, the rumble of Harley-Davidson engines rolled down Main Street. Elaine heard them from the kitchen. That familiar thunder that had once made Dottie beg to lock the door. She wiped her hands on her apron and moved to the front, and the sound of her footsteps was the sound of a woman walking towards something she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. 12 motorcycles pulled into the parking spaces out front. Boone Crandall dismounted first, pulling off his helmet. His gray-streaked beard was longer now, and his face carried something it had not carried 6 months ago. Ease. The particular relaxation of a man approaching a place where he knew he was welcome. "Morning, Elaine," he called. "We were in the area. Thought we would stop for breakfast, if that is still all right." The diner was full. Sunday morning rush. Families and couples and regulars occupying every booth and table with the comfortable routine of people who had rebuilt their lives and their habits and their faith in ordinary mornings. But something remarkable was happening. People were standing, moving toward the door, not away from it. Earl Pemberton held the door open. He did not smile exactly, but his face held none of the fear it had worn 6 months ago. Whatever wall had existed between his gratitude and his comfort had been slowly, quietly dismantled by time and thought and the quiet courage it took to change your mind. Nora Strickland waved from her regular booth. Caleb Mercer, who had been eating pancakes with his parents, pressed his face against the window and grinned with the unself-conscious joy of a 7-year-old greeting his heroes. "More than all right," Elaine said. She held the door wide, and the 12 bikers filed in, greeted now with nods and smiles and the murmured hellos of people who had learned to see past leather to the human beings beneath it. "Welcome home." She poured 12 cups of coffee, took 12 orders, served 12 breakfasts to 12 people who had proven that heroism had nothing to do with how you looked and everything to do with what you did when it mattered. On the wall among the photographs documenting Pine Ridge's history, Caleb's crayon drawing held a place of honor. 12 motorcycles in a circle of flame, stick figures with their arms raised, and 4 words in a child's handwriting that said everything that needed to be said. "You are the good guys." In Pine Ridge, California, population 3,843, fewer than before, but rebuilding the bell above Elaine's diner chimed throughout the morning. And sometimes the best way to judge a person's character was not by reputation or appearance, but by what they did when the fire came and the road was burning and a 7-year-old boy was hiding in a closet waiting for someone brave enough to find him.